Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Financial Issues Forum featuring Daniel Schulman speaking on his book, The Money Kings. My name is Sri Chatterjee, and I am a professor of finance at the Gabili School, and I serve as the Gabili Chair for the Center for Global Security Analysis at Fordham University. On behalf of the entire Gabili School, a very warm welcome to all of you. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me mention that the Financial Issues Forum is a collaboration of three partners: the Museum of American Finance, the CFA Society of New York, and the Gabili Center for Global Security Analysis at Fordham. Our goal is to bring renowned experts from many different fields throughout the year to speak on topics and issues that are relevant to the economy, the market, and to you. In a few minutes, David Cowan, the president and CEO of the Museum of American Finance, will give a full introduction for our speaker, who will speak for about 40 minutes, at which point he will address questions submitted through the question field located below the video player. Please feel free to submit questions at any point throughout the event. We will be addressing as many of them as possible during this Q&A session. All attendees of today's event will be receiving digital copies of the book, The Money Kings, with information coming to you following our event. And now, over to my good friend, David.
Thanks, Harish. Great to see you. Great to be back as we continue this plethora of incredible programming this spring. Daniel Schulman is the deputy editor for News and Politics for Mother Jones, whose tagline is Smart, Fearless Journalism. Daniel's work has appeared in a variety of outlets, including The Atlantic, the Boston Globe Magazine, the LA Times, Politico, Vanity Fair, and the Washington Post. His first published book, Sons of Wichita, about the Koch brothers, became a New York Times bestseller. The Money Kings is carefully researched, and the subtitle says it all: the epic story of the Jewish immigrants who transformed Wall Street and shaped modern America. Now, there's something I wanted to share from the credits that caught my eye, which rings true for any author. In his lovely tribute to his family, he shares, quote unquote, a book, however large or small, consumes a lot of emotional and intellectual space. You live with it, which means your loved ones must live with it as well. To them, I imagine it begins to feel like a visiting relative who was entertaining at first, but who has long since overstayed their welcome, in this case for 8 years. Well, we are the lucky ones, as the end result of your 8 years of labor is the highly informative and entertaining book, The Money Kings. I'm pleased to introduce Daniel Schulman.
Thank you so much, David. It's a real honor to be with you this afternoon. So, I want to start out by telling you about a pretty amazing place that I visited during the research process for my book. You financial history buffs out there, or New York City history buffs, will appreciate it. It's called Salem Fields, and it is an old cemetery that straddles Brooklyn and Queens. It was established about 175 years ago by the Congregation of Temple Emmanuel, which is a Reformed synagogue in Manhattan that was really the epicenter of the German Jewish elite, especially during the Gilded Age. You drive through the granite archway, and you can see that on your screen on the left. And you're really transported to another world. The cemetery is filled with grand mausoleums of varying ostentation. Some feature stained glass windows from Tiffany that depict biblical tableaus. But what's so interesting about Salem Field is that many of the through lines of the past converge here, and you can begin to visualize the guideposts to not just the modern financial era, but where we are today in many ways. The names you see as you walk through the paths there are familiar ones: Bloomingdale and Guggenheim, Goldman Sachs and Lehman. And here in some of these slides, you can, up top, that's the Guggenheim Mausoleum, which was modeled on the Tower of the Winds in Athens. And to the right is the Bloomingdale Mausoleum, and below is the Seligmans. Now, as you wind through these paths, high up on a hillside overlooking many of the rest of these mausoleums is one that looks like you might find it on Mount Olympus or something like that. And that is the final resting place of the financier and philanthropist Jacob Schiff. Schiff, who's pictured here to the right, and that's his mausoleum there on the left, he's not very well remembered today, but he was a colossus of finance and Jewish life during his lifetime. J.P. Morgan, who was Schiff's contemporary, is widely considered the greatest banker of the Gilded Age and perhaps the most pivotal financial figure in modern American history. But Schiff, who was the head of the mighty investment bank of Kuhn Loeb, could easily assert a claim to that title. This here is a photograph of the Schiff and Loeb families, who were founders of the Kuhn Loeb Investment Bank. We can take this full screen if you wouldn't mind. Now, at the center of this picture, just at the center to the right is Jacob Schiff, and to his left is his wife Therese. At far left, wearing the interesting facial hair that makes him look like an elderly Wolverine, is Solomon Loeb. And also in this image are members of the Warburg family who were in-laws of the Schiffs. Now, up top on the balcony to the right is Otto Kahn, who was one of Schiff's business partners at Kuhn Loeb and really one of the most famous bankers of the Gilded Age. He is also said to be one of the people that were that inspired the Monopoly Man. So Google the Monopoly Man and Otto Kahn after this. It's interesting. So Schiff was the unelected but undisputed leader of American Jewry. He was not just one of the most famous financiers of his time, and not just in the U.S., but internationally. He presided over a philanthropic era that is really unparalleled in modern American history. Schiff's lifetime was sometimes known as the Schiff era, if that gives you any sense of the magnitude of his legacy. Now, what was interesting about Schiff is that he was a man who bridged two worlds. One was the opulent world of the Upper East Side, the rarefied world of the German Jewish elite. And then there was the world of the often impoverished immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe, who lived downtown. So he bridged both uptown and downtown during his lifetime. His office on William Street was basically considered the equivalent of the White House by Jewish communal workers and philanthropic stewards who tramped in to meet him day after day, seeking his advice or blessing. There was really nothing that got done in the Jewish world during his lifetime without his blessing or his say-so. And I'll paint you just a quick picture of how he was viewed during his lifetime. On the day of his funeral in 1920, the streets of the Lower East Side were eerily quiet. Usually the push carts that populated the area would be in full swing, but they were shuttered today, as were the storefronts, and many of them had placards that were tucked into the windows that read, "The East Side mourns the loss of Jacob H. Schiff." Apparently, there were about 10,000 of these placed throughout the neighborhood. Hundreds of condolence telegrams poured in from around the world from world leaders and dignitaries. In his own cable, President Woodrow Wilson lamented the loss of one of the nation's, quote, most useful citizens. Uptown, the pews of Temple Emmanuel, where the service was held, were filled with VIPs. You picture the presidents of the Union Pacific Railroads and the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was one of the largest corporations in the United States at the time, a current ambassador and a future one, the mining magnate Daniel Guggenheim, a founder of Sears, Julius Rosenwald, New York Times publisher Adolph Ochs, James Wilson, who was the Civil War general who captured Jefferson Davis. Now, these prominent men were just Schiff's pallbearers. But the sight of famous tycoons and politicians within the temple paled in comparison to the spectacle that greeted you outside. Now, as Schiff's funeral procession traveled down Fifth Avenue, it was greeted by a crowd of thousands, and you can see some of that in the New York Times front page cover there. Many of the people who trekked to see his funeral procession that day were poor immigrants from the Lower East Side who had come to pay their respects and who bowed their heads low as his casket passed. Now, after the service, members of this crowd joined the procession as it headed uptown en route to Queensboro Bridge, and from there to Schiff's final resting place at Salem Field. Now, Schiff is the central figure in my new book, Money Kings, but you can't tell his story without including the remarkable group of German Jewish families who formed his business, social, and philanthropic circle. And I'm talking about the families of Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Kuhn Loeb, of course, and J&W Seligman and Company. I'm often asked about the title of my book. Why did I name it The Money Kings? Does that have anti-Semitic connotations? Now, I can tell you that I wrestled with whether to write this story at all. This is a book about Jewish money, power, and influence. It's a book about Jewish financiers with tremendous legacies. In many ways, we're living in the world that they helped to build. Did writing this book risk giving ammunition to anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists? As I researched the life of Schiff and his contemporaries, it was clear to me that these same bad actors, these same conspiracy theorists, seemed the most invested in keeping the memory of Schiff and his contemporaries alive, but for all the wrong reasons. They cherry-picked from their biographies and disfigured their legacies and accomplishments in order to create these dangerous myths about Jewish finance and power. I concluded that it was important to write this book and to tell their stories in an unvarnished way. Now, as for the title Money Kings, that comes from the term the pundits and papers of the Gilded Age used to describe the biggest tycoons of that era. It wasn't just a term for Jewish bankers. Schiff was often described as a money king, but so was J.P. Morgan. But I wouldn't hesitate to write a book about Morgan or John Rockefeller and call it Money Kings. Why would I be reluctant to write a book about Schiff and Joseph Seligman and call it the same? Who were they, if not money kings? I think it's a dangerous thing when anti-Semitism can infect how we present history itself. So that's why this book is called Money Kings. And within the story is the tale of how myths of Jewish money and power came to be. And we're going to circle back to that a little later. But as you begin to review the biographies of the Money Kings, it's kind of remarkable, based on their origins, that they were ever written in to these conspiracy theories at all. In this slide, you have the famous Lehman Brothers, Meyer, who is on the left, and Emanuel is on the right. Their older brother, Henry, died in the 1850s, was the first to come to the United States from Bavaria. He was a peddler in Alabama and eventually opened a store in Montgomery. Our currency system at the time was very unreliable. You had all sorts of banks issuing paper money, and much of it turned out to be counterfeit, and this would eventually lead to the creation of the Secret Service. But because our currency system was so unreliable, the Lehmans really did business largely in cotton, and that is how they eventually entered the commodities business. They accepted cotton exchange for goods and slowly grew more and more immersed in this business. In these slides, we have the Goldman and Sachs families. To the left is Sam Sachs, one of the namesakes of Goldman Sachs. The firm was founded by another immigrant peddler. His name is Marcus Goldman, and he arrived in the U.S. in the late 1840s. And he was part of a major wave of German and German Jewish immigration that was unleashed by revolutions that had occurred throughout Western Europe. These revolutions were uprising against feudalism And while the exact rationale differed from place to place, at the heart of these protests was a call for basic equal rights. These protests were pretty brutally put down, and many immigrants who came to the United States at that time were fleeing for these lives. These immigrants were sometimes known as 48ers, and in fact, a number of the founders of the firms that I write about and I'm going to be speaking about today came over in this wave. One interesting piece of trivia that I discovered about Goldman Sachs is that it was very nearly called Putzel Goldman, which doesn't really have the same ring to it, does it? There was a fellow named Meyer Putzel who was Marcus Goldman's first partner in the finance business, and they ended up parting ways. So there you have it, Goldman Sachs. Now, in this next slide, here are Joseph and Jesse Seligman, two of the 8 brothers who composed the Seligman banking dynasty. Seligmans aren't very well known today, but during their time, they ran one of the largest investment banks in the United States with branches around the world. They considered themselves the American Rothschilds. They explicitly referred to themselves that way. And they eventually formed branches in New York, London, Paris, and Frankfurt, very much emulating the model of the Rothschild family, which similarly fanned out across the globe. Joseph came to the United States from Bavaria in the late 1830s. He settled first in Pennsylvania, and after clerking at a dry goods business, set out to make his fortune as a peddler. The Seligman story is representative of how chains of migration worked, based on Joseph's experience in the United States, and presumably based on the effusive letters he was writing home to relatives. Eventually, the entire family came to join him in the United States. The Seligmans, like the Lehmans, gravitated south at first, and they established a few dry goods stores in Alabama. But unlike the Lehmans, they returned north prior to the Civil War. Here on this next slide, we have the founders of Kuhn Loeb, Solomon Loeb and Abraham Kuhn. Over the years, the Kuhn Loeb name really disappeared from Wall Street. In the 1970s, it merged with Lehman Brothers, and the merged firm was later acquired by American Express. But at one time, Kuhn Loeb was one of the very best known investment banks in the world, very much up there with JP Morgan and Company. Solomon Loeb and Abraham Kuhn were actually brothers-in-law twice over. Abraham married Solomon's sister. Solomon married Abraham's sister. Abraham was the first to establish himself in the United States. He and his brothers peddled in Indiana largely, and eventually opened a dry goods store in Lafayette. Solomon joined his sister and new brother-in-law there, and the Kuhns and Loebs eventually moved to Cincinnati, which had a very large German and German Jewish population. Cincinnati was at the center of the clothing trade at the time, and Kuhn Loeb established itself first as a thriving clothing business. It was initially called Kuhn Netter. Jacob Netter was one of their early partners. But by now, you are probably sensing that there is a pattern going on here. German Jews who come from Bavaria who get their start peddling. Amazingly, their firms emerged from the crushing rucksacks and horse-drawn carts of immigrant peddlers who came to the United States, largely in the mid-1800s. And they came here because they were seeking opportunities that were closed to them in Germany, where Jews were barred from most professions. They were prohibited from property ownership in many places. They were told where they couldn't go, and where they could and couldn't live. In fact, they were forced to pay taxes to reside in various towns. But I'm often asked why 19th century Jewish immigrants gravitated towards peddling. And the answer is a pretty simple one. Peddling was the most common startup profession because it was a familiar one. This type of mercantile role was one of the few jobs available to their fathers and grandfathers in the old country. So they gravitated towards what they knew. The great-grandson of one of the founders of Lehman Brothers called peddling the Harvard Business School for Jewish boys. It's kind of funny, but there's certainly an element of truth to this because peddling offered a crash course in business, in the English language, and American traditions and customs. To be successful, you had to be resourceful, adventurous, and you had to quickly establish rapport with your customers. Now, the Money Kings pivoted to finance right after the Civil War, and there was a reason for that. For one thing, these firms were fairly well established when the war erupted, and they were able to get government contracts to supply clothing and other necessities. With the exceptions of the Lehmans, who were based in Alabama and aligned with the Confederacy, these were all Union contracts. Financing the war required large-scale bond-selling operations on both sides, and it hastened the financialization of American life. Now, on the right, you can see an advertisement for some of the bonds on offer during that era. And on the left-hand side, you can see Meyer Lehman's petition for a pardon. One of the interesting things I found in my research is that both Meyer and Emanuel, in their pardon applications, definitely did not tell the truth about how many assets they had at the time. There was an asset limit for this type of thing, but both of them were pardoned for their role in the war. Now, firms such as Lehman and Seligman and Company, they both began dipping a toe into finance during the Civil War by selling war bonds in Europe. And by war's end, the clothing and dry goods businesses that all of these firms had been involved in were flooded by new entrants that had come into this business seeking government contracts. But these entrepreneurs, the founders of Lehman and Seligman and Kuhn Loeb, what they recognized was that the cream was off the business, as the son of one of Kuhn Loeb's founders put it. And they were equally quick to see the possibilities that banking and finance offered as the United States entered a new era. And they had built up the capital and contacts to make that leap. Now, unlike the earlier generation of German Jewish immigrants who had arrived in the United States in the mid-1800s, Jacob Schiff came here in 1865, August 1865, directly after the Civil War had concluded, and he did not arrive by way of steerage like Joseph Seligman or the Lehmans or this earlier generation of bootstrapping German Jewish immigrants. He hailed from a prominent family in Frankfurt's tight-knit Jewish community, and his family tree was populated by businessmen and religious scholars and other prominent citizens. Members of the Schiff family occupied one of the grandest homes in Frankfurt's Jewish quarter. The area was called Jew Street, if that gives you a sense of how Jews were perceived in Germany at that time. It was a two-family home, excuse me. And what was interesting is that Meyer Rothschild, who was the patriarch of the Rothschild banking dynasty, bought this home from the Schiffs in the late 1700s. Before Schiff was 20, he had co-founded a brokerage and had plunged into the unruly realm of railroad finance. He would soon marry into the Kuhn Loeb banking dynasty and very quickly become its most important partner. He actually had some financial training, and unlike his father-in-law, and he sort of ended up elbowing Solomon Loeb out of the business. Over the next 50 years, Schiff would pilot Kuhn Loeb to the very top strata of American and international finance. His only real equal on Wall Street was J.P. Morgan. Schiff channeled hundreds of millions and perhaps billions of European investment capital into American industry, especially the railroads. One of his signature feats was the turnaround and restoration of the bankrupt Union Pacific system. But he was also a banker to iconic 20th century companies such as Western Union and Westinghouse. He played a vital role in transforming the United States from an emerging market into an economic superpower. The orbit of German Jewish dynasties that Schiff occupied also played a vital role in the development of the modern economy and the policies and institutions that undergird it. Here we have Paul Warburg, who was Schiff's partner in Kuhn Loeb, and also his brother-in-law. As you'll find with many of these families, the family and business ties are very closely interwoven. Warburg was one of the architects of the Federal Reserve System. When he came to the U.S. in the early 1900s, we still had no central bank, which placed us in the minority among major world economies. Our currency was inelastic; it did not contract or expand based on demand, and this led to frequent financial panics and bank runs that were quite devastating to the economy. Now, Warburg ended up leading the push to create a central bank, even though this was not a very popular idea at the time, and he served on the first Fed board. World War I erupts just as the Federal Reserve Board gets underway, and because of Warburg's German background and suspicions about his allegiances, his term on the board was not renewed by Woodrow Wilson, but he would continue to play a formative role in international finance for the remainder of his life. That would include playing a leading but futile role along with John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, in pushing for the Allies to reduce German war reparations in the aftermath of World War I. In this picture, we have a fellow named Edwin Seligman. It's quite interesting to think about today, but one of the scions of one of America's wealthiest banking dynasties, was actually one of the leading crusaders for levying a federal income tax. Edwin, who was Joseph Seligman's son, was a Columbia University economist who was integral to the effort to ratify the 16th Amendment, authorizing a federal income tax. And he was one of the intellectual forefathers of progressive taxation, on which our tax system is based. An interesting side note here is that several members of the extended Seligman family who were then residing overseas ended up renouncing their U.S. citizenship around the time that the 16th Amendment was passed. Then there are Henry Goldman and Philip Lehman, who were childhood friends whose fathers had co-founded Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers, respectively. Together, they formed an alliance between their family firms to underwrite the type of consumer and retail businesses that were ignored by the major investment banks, who were really interested in the industrial concerns and the railroads. Now, JP Morgan and other investment banks focused on these firms largely, and their share value was often pegged to their physical assets. But Goldman and Lehman believed that intangibles such as future earning power and goodwill, in other words, customer loyalty, the power of the brand, those sorts of things, could and should be factored into share pricing. They wound up helping to pioneer the modern IPO, and companies such as Sears and Woolworth are just a sampling of the many household name businesses that grew and thrived as a result of their financial innovation. But the legacy of the financial dynasties I write about in my book went very far beyond finance, and especially in Jacob Schiff's case, their philanthropic legacy rivaled, if not surpassed, their financial legacy. Between 1819 and 1920, which were the decades that Schiff was most active, the Jewish population of the United States swelled from 400,000 to 3.4 million. These immigrants were fleeing increasingly oppressive living conditions and flare-ups of mob violence targeting Jewish communities in the Pale of Settlement, which was the territory on the fringe of the Western Empire, the Russian Empire, where Jews were permitted to live. The deluge of immigration predictably caused a nativist backlash, and politicians began stoking fears of disease-carrying foreign criminals who were stealing American jobs and contributing to the moral and cultural decay of American society. This debate, as you'll find, really hasn't moved very far in the past 140 years. Now, for Schiff for years, Schiff and his fellow philanthropic stewards beat back nativist efforts to block Jewish immigration. To ensure these new arrivals would not become a burden on public resources or so-called public charges, Schiff and his allies essentially struck a bargain with political leaders. They would shoulder the weighty obligation to take care of their own, and this is what they did. They poured millions into efforts to help Jews in the United States and abroad. Job training programs, schools, hospitals, English lessons. Schiff helped to found and fund organizations that provided these services and many more. Not only did he and fellow Jewish philanthropists anticipate the immediate needs of the new arrivals, they paved the way for their rapid Americanization. Many of the organizations they founded and funded during that era still exist, and that includes the 92nd Street Y and the Henry Street Settlement and the American Jewish Committee and the Joint Distribution Committee, many, many more. This philanthropy, though, wasn't entirely selfless. There was also a self-interested aspect of it. Quite simply, they understood that this flood of impoverished provincial immigrants, who the German Jews really shared very little in common with other than their religion, they understood that they could easily tarnish their own tenuous and very hard-fought standing within the American social hierarchy. Now, by the early 1900s, conditions on the Lower East Side in particular were a big problem. It was a haven for drugs and prostitution and crime. Jewish gangsters and criminals who had names like Jaime Hundred and Stiff Rivka ruled those streets. Things came to a head when New York's police commissioner wrote an article stating that 50% of New York's criminal element were Jews. This wasn't true at all, but it actually didn't matter because it didn't make it any less alarming or dangerous. The response to this by Schiff and his allies was remarkable, and it was quite telling. They hired a detective to penetrate the criminal underworld of the Lower East Side, and they partnered with the New York police to target and prosecute these criminals, and basically purge the criminal element from downtown. Their attempts at image management were visible elsewhere as well. In this, on the left, is a picture of some of the first immigrants who arrived in Galveston, Texas, as part of something that was known as the Galveston Movement. Now, for a time, the German Jewish philanthropic stewards attempted all these ill-fated schemes to deflect Jewish immigrants away from New York City and into the more sparsely settled parts of the country. This was one of Schiff's signature efforts, Galveston, and it sounds kind of outlandish today, but the idea was to prevent Jewish immigrants from even setting foot in New York by routing them directly to Galveston and from there to locations in the American interior. If you can't understand why some of your Jewish relatives ended up in, say, Missouri or someplace like that, now you have an answer. There were many skirmishes between the German Jews and the new arrivals, and the resentments over the somewhat haughty and paternalistic posture of the Germans toward their brethren existed for generations. It exists today, in fact. Nevertheless, on a very basic level, if you hail from an American Jewish family with Russian or Eastern European roots like I do, there's a very good possibility your American story would not have been written without them. World War I was a defining moment globally, of course, and it was an especially dramatic time for the German Jewish community in the United States. It fractured families, it shattered firms, it challenged the identities of men such as Jacob Schiff. Schiff had often spoken quite proudly of what he called the trinity of his heritage as a German, an American, and as a Jew. And this war would bring his identity, as it would many others like him, into bitter conflict, especially as public opinion turned against Germany after the sinking of the Lusitania. Schiff largely refused to allow his firm to bankroll the combatants in this war, and this ended up having a lasting effect on his firm, Kuhn Loeb, which was branded as pro-German. And it really lost a lot of its prestige in this era. And of course, as I noted earlier, Paul Warburg, who had left his Kuhn Loeb partnership to join the Fed, was not renewed in his term because of his German ancestry. The war and the differing allegiances of the partners became a flashpoint in a number of firms. Kuhn Loeb was one of them, but it really became an existential crisis within Goldman Sachs. Sam Sachs was staunchly pro-ally, as was the case with many second-generation German Americans. Henry Goldman, who was his brother-in-law, on the other hand, he was very staunchly and outspokenly pro-German, and this caused a crisis within the firm. Eventually, Henry Goldman resigned, and in this slide here, you can see his resignation letter, which is very interesting. It's very interestingly written on "Save and Serve Liberty Bond" with the Liberty Bond logo on it, kind of poetic in a way. Eventually, Goldman resigns, and he was the last Goldman to work for the firm that his father had founded. And this rift ended up rippling through the family. World War I was also the gateway to a sad and tragic chapter in the story of the Money Kings. Schiff and his allies believed they were on the cusp of a new era in which ancient prejudices and stereotypes were receding. And they had been diligent about trying to stamp out anti-Semitism wherever they saw it. But not only would anti-Semitism come roaring back in a new and virulent form during the early 20th century, but Schiff and his friends would figure prominently in these conspiracy theories, and these conspiracy theories persist today. One thing that really amazed me while writing this book was just how much modern anti-Semitism, which is related but distinct from the medieval variety, traces back to just one person. You probably know him as America's foremost automaker, but Henry Ford was also, and maybe more consequentially, the nation's leading purveyor of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories through his Dearborn Independent newspaper, which over a period of 7 years and 92 issues attacked Jews for everything you could possibly imagine, from financial panics and predation and wars to wrecking American baseball and the popularity of jazz music even, which the Dearborn Independent claimed was a Jewish creation that was leading to moral degeneracy. The Dearborn Independent reached a huge audience in the United States. It was one of the nation's most widely circulated papers. But if that wasn't enough, Ford's operation collected these articles into 4 volumes, which they called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. Millions of copies were printed around the world, including in Germany, where in the 1920s, the up-and-coming Nazi movement blanketed the country with copies of this. Adolf Hitler was a huge Ford fan who kept a portrait of the automaker in his office. And in one of these slides, you can see Ford in 1938 receiving a medal from the Germans. So when you hear anti-Semitic codes such as international banker or globalist, or more overt attacks on people like George Soros, know that this is all flowing from what Ford helped to unleash upon the world all those years ago. This is someone you're probably not familiar with. His name is Boris Brazel. His impact on the Jewish people was equally profound. He was a fiercely anti-Semitic fellow, a member of the Black Hundreds, who were the fervent supporters of the Russian Tsar, who were often at the heart of Russia's pogroms. During World War I, Brazel took a diplomatic post in New York, and he remained in the United States after the Russian Revolution in 1917 deposed the ruling Romanov family. The United States was in the midst of the first Red Scare at the time, and Brazel began working for U.S. military intelligence, investigating what he considered the most subversive element of all, which was the Jews. He was responsible for bringing the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is the touchstone of modern anti-Semitism, to the attention of American authorities, all the way up to President Wilson himself. This forged and fraudulent text purported to be the Jewish master plan for world domination, and it had been first published in the early 1900s, but had not circulated outside of Russia. Brazel anonymously published the first American version, and he linked up with Henry Ford and his Dearborn Independent. And it was Brazel who helped to shape the paper's anti-Semitic campaign, which was based upon and built upon the themes of the protocols. And Brazel had a particular fixation with Jacob Schiff. Intelligence records that I've seen suggest he was regularly supplying false information about Schiff and his Kuhn Loeb partners to the U.S. military. Thankfully, Schiff did not live to see it, but Ford's paper would make Schiff a prime target of its anti-Semitic writings. When I started working on this project 8 years ago, I knew the stories of Schiff and his contemporaries were important, but what I didn't realize was how relevant their stories would be. I've been surprised and somewhat dismayed by the many modern echoes from that era. The ongoing immigration wars, the debate over tech monopolies and income inequality, the skirmishes that we are seeing today inside and outside of the Jewish community over Israel and Zionism. All that was present then as it is now. And sadly, anti-Semitism too is on the rise. And the world of over a century ago, the world of the Money Kings, seems much closer than ever. Thank you. And I'm happy to take your questions now.
Thank you, Daniel. Let me start with the first question here from Susan Weed. The question is, what is their most long-lasting contribution to the street, in your opinion? What did the fall of Lehman Brothers represent in this context, if anything?
Oh, those are great questions. I think they contributed in a number of ways. I talked a little bit about Henry Goldman and Philip Lehman and the role they played in the early 1900s in pioneering the modern IPO and helping to finance some of these household name companies that everyone has heard of today. Now, these were companies that were not receiving much attention from other firms, and they were able to grow into massive businesses because of that. And of course, you have their impact on regulation and financial regulatory institutions, such as the Federal Reserve, which play a huge role in the modern economy. The fall of Lehman Brothers. Now, this is an interesting topic, because by the time Lehman Brothers unraveled, this was no longer the partnership of a family. It had merged with American Express and been spun off as a public company. And there's a longer story to be had about how these partnerships ended up becoming partnerships where the partners were investing their own capital into public companies where they were investing the public's money.
Great. And to the audience, please feel free to put your questions in. There is some time here for doing a little Q&A. I'm just curious, 8 years in writing and researching, and just wondering, I think you talked to some descendants. Did you get some previously unpublished material? And how was your research phase of this? And when did you start writing as opposed to researching?
I usually try to write as I go along, but this was an interesting project in that there were not many people that I could speak to. There were not any people I could speak to who really knew any of the figures personally that I was writing about. So often, as is the case in many families, you hear stories about your ancestors, and they turn out not to be true at all. And so I heard a lot of stories that I had to sort of try to figure out if there was any legitimacy to these things. But the best source for any historical work is, letters that were written during that era, especially. And I was lucky in that there was a trove of unpublished Schiff letters that I was able to utilize. But another fascinating resource that I came upon while I was working on this were the credit report ledgers of R.G. Dunn and Company, which, going back a couple hundred years, was rating the credit of all sorts of businesses throughout the United States. And these ledgers don't include, just dry observations. They have a lot of color in them. It's like, oh, so-and-so has a drinking problem. That sort of stuff is in there. And when it came to firms like the Lehman Brothers, one thing that I was fascinated by was how they were viewed when they came to the United States. And what was interesting is that when they get to Alabama because they're Jewish, R.G. Dunn and Company says you shouldn't trust them. And and then 10 years later, as they establish themselves, it says Lehman Brothers, stand well, almost as good as white men, something like that. But it just includes a lot of riveting detail. But during the research process, I was all over the place, from Berlin to Norman, Oklahoma, where improbably the papers of J&W and Seligman and Company ended up.
Here's another question from the audience from Richard Warshauer. Do you think the current corporate raiders from Milken to Nelson Peltz and Carl Icahn are the modern money kings? Are they contributing to current anti-Semitism?
I don't know that they're necessarily contributing to anti-Semitism, and I think that folks like Jacob Schiff, one thing that was interesting about him is that his financial role was quite balanced with his philanthropic one. In some ways, he was a greater philanthropist than he was a financier, and he was a great financier. You saw a lot of tycoons during that era that were part of this German Jewish elite world, playing a remarkable role in philanthropy that was focused on the less fortunate. And they did this really, Schiff especially did not attach his name to many of his gifts. But these days, everybody seems to want to slap their name on the wall of a theater. So I think in that aspect, things are quite different. But I think that any of Wall Street's titans these days are really walking in the shadow of men like Schiff.
Ellen Lapson wants to know about, and you talked a little bit about this, but the relationship between the Jewish banking families and J.P. Morgan, Frick, Carnegie, etc.
That's a great question. They all swam in the same waters, and the firms J.P. Morgan and Kuhn Loeb actually had a fairly close working relationship. There was, whenever a major deal came down, they would offer each other, out of respect, participation. But Schiff and Morgan sort of eyed each other with a bit of mutual suspicion. They were not friends. They were collegial, but they ended up doing a huge amount of business together. And Kuhn Loeb worked with the Rockefellers and all of those major financiers during that day. But one thing that was quite interesting is that there was a lot of social separation after the workday was done. So you had, Jewish Wall Street and then Gentile Wall Street. And, in many cases, there was not much mixing after 5:00 p.m. But otherwise, there were deep relationships between these firms.
Question from Vladimir Augustine. Sidney Weinberg, 1891 to 1969, is often credited with leading Goldman Sachs to recover from the Depression and thriving, and even helping take Ford Motor Company public. Coming from a poor Brooklyn background, how was he viewed amongst the money kings and their descendants?
Oh, that's a good question. He certainly did play a role in helping to pull Goldman Sachs out of the Depression, although Goldman Sachs played its own formative role in helping to cause, not alone, but in helping to cause that depression by setting up these investment trusts, which were the sort of predecessor of the modern mutual fund. And they were using these investment trusts to inflate each other, causing a massive bubble. Now, what's interesting is that around the time that Sidney Weinberg joins Goldman Sachs, a lot of these firms were becoming a lot less insular. But it's true that his background was totally unlike those of the partners of his firms. Sidney Weinberg was taken under the wing of Paul Sachs, who was one of Sam Sachs's sons, and who I think he helped to send him to business school, in fact, and that's how he ends up, rising through the ranks of Goldman Sachs. Now, you bring up the Ford IPO, which is a fascinating moment, because how, as a Jewish firm, do you do business with Ford's company, even though it was now in the hands of his son, after what Ford had done just a few years earlier? Um, and I think, one thing I found is that a lot of these firms and families were striving so hard to assimilate that, they went after this business despite Ford's reputation of anti-Semitism.
Dennis Sullivan, curious, any descendants of the Money Kings, active players in today's financial landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Schiffs are still involved in finance. Drew Schiff works in private equity. His brother Scott is also runs a finance firm. Their father David was a partner in Kuhn Loeb and briefly at Kuhn Loeb Lehman Brothers. But I think, as you'll find in many cases with the scions of these families, like oftentimes the fortunes of these families becomes diluted over the generations, and descendants go into different fields. But certainly within the Schiff family, they're still involved in finance.
Very happy to read the next question from Professor Richard Silla, who, by the way, is co-teaching a class with David at Fordham right this semester. So Professor Silla wants to know, since many of these folks arrived in the US relatively poor, how did they manage to connect with large pools of German European capital and bring that capital to the US?
That's fascinating. That's a great question. One thing that I sort of found, especially with Schiff, who was in many ways the most responsible for bringing German capital into railroads and other industrial concerns, is that Schiff came here and he was very well connected. His father had worked in finance, possibly for the Rothschilds. I wasn't able to fully track that down, but some people think that was the case. Before he was 20, he had started his own brokerage and was very soon after that doing major deals in conjunction with another Frankfurt-based company. That suggests to me that he already had those connections in place. Now, as for firms like the Seligmans or the Lehmans, this was a much more gradual thing, but it was also built upon family networks. Who could you trust during that era, other than family? And that's why you see so many of these firms, the family ties are so closely interwoven. But in many cases, they were doing business with brothers-in-law or other cousins, other family members. The Lehmans, one of the ways the Lehmans survived the Civil War is that one of their brother-in-law was based in Liverpool and was basically able to accept illicit shipments of cotton. So I think it varied a bit, but as in terms of Schiff, he definitely had those contacts to begin with.
Alistair DuPont, he believes Schiff was integral to financing Lenin's takeover in Russia. Is that true? Do you know how linked he was to American foreign policy at this time?
Great question. So, the myth about the Jewish banker, a lot of myths about Jewish banker trace in part to Jacob Schiff and his financing for Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, which is one of the most fascinating episodes of his career. Now, if you look at it without context, you say, oh my God, a Jewish banker financed Japan's war effort in 1905? But this is how wars happened at that time. And the reason that he ended up financing Japan, which was considered the underdog in this war, was because for decades he'd been trying to get the Russian Tsar to improve its treatment of the Jews, who were being routinely murdered in the Pale of Settlement. And he said, you know what? I've been approached about financing the Japanese in this war. I'm going to do it, and it's going to teach Russia a lesson. Now, this was in 1905. many of the conspiracy theories about the Russian Revolution sort of emerged from this era, and elements of truth were cherry picked into this idea that Schiff financed Trotsky and Lenin and caused the Russian Revolution in 1917. Not only caused it, but ordered the assassination of the Romanov family, which is of course not at all true. But that's where these conspiracy theories come from, and it's no accident that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which I referred to earlier, it was first published in the early 1900s, around the time of the Russo-Japanese War, and I would be very surprised if Jacob Schiff was not on the mind of the person who forged that when it was written.
Celia Wong wants to know, what are your favorite books along this journey of research?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm a big Ron Chernow fan. His book, I relied on his book on the Warburgs quite a bit, but also his work on Rockefeller and Hamilton and others is really has been formative to me. I've got my wall of books over here. I mean, I was The Power Broker is not just a book that was important for my research here, but journalistically has been an influence on my work. That was actually assigned at Columbia's journalism school when you had to show up there having read The Power Broker, or at least having said that you read The Power Broker. But I recommend reading it. But those are just a few. Roger Lowenstein's work on the Fed is fantastic. But but those are just a few.
Our friend Professor Gerard Goldberg, writing from Israel, did the Money Kings help in financing early Zionism?
Amazing. That's a great question. That's a fascinating question, because they, in fact, not only did they not help to finance Zionism, they were bitter opponents of Zionism, because Zionism sort of emerges in Europe in tandem with these waves of immigration that were occurring, that were coming from Russia at that time, and the German Jews viewed the United States as their refuge. They in fact would sometimes refer to it as their Zion. People like Schiff, and I mentioned this earlier, how zealously they guarded the image of Jews, but people like Schiff were afraid that this notion of creating a Jewish state would underscore these age-old canards about Jewish loyalties and dual loyalties. They could never be loyal to the places where they lived. They would only be loyal to Jews. They worried that Jews would be painted by the same brush, and it wouldn't matter if you lived in a Jewish state or in the United States. People would view you the same way, and you see some of this stuff borne out currently. So obviously, Schiff dies in 1920. The conversation about Zionism in Israel changes radically after that. And in fact, the doors of immigration are slammed shut in 1924. So it was no longer possible for the United States to be a Jewish refuge. But in the early 1900s, the default position of many American Jews, not just German American Jews, was opposition to Zionism.
There are many questions from the audience. Perhaps we have time for one or two more. Here's a question from Jim Smith. When did Lehman, Goldman, Seligman, Kuhn Loeb start to integrate below the founders themselves?
That's a good question. So Kuhn Loeb, are we talking about when the firms actually merged? Is that the question?
The question doesn't say this, but it just says, when did they start to integrate below the founders themselves?
Well, in terms of, you do see like a lot of these firms start to consolidate in the 1970s, which was when both deregulation and other factors caused many of these small partnerships to seek refuge with larger firms. So I think Kuhn Loeb and Lehman Brothers ends up merging in 1977. The Seligman firm at some point was bought by Ameriprise, and their international affiliates ended up going out of business or being purchased before that. And as for Goldman Sachs, it's sort of the one firm that is still standing of that group.
So we've got just time for one more. We got a couple. Roman letter. How about the Jewish lawyers? Are they mentioned at all? Did you do any work on that? Were they, coming into line at all at the same time?
That's interesting. I didn't do as much work on that as I would like to. My father was a Jewish lawyer, so I should probably check into that a bit more. No, but that world was very much part of one of Chip's closest associates was Louis Marshall, who was a prominent lawyer. You have folks like Samuel Untermeyer, also a prominent Jewish lawyer during that era. And you have some of the sons of these, the founders of these firms also go into the legal profession. Julius Goldman, Marcus Goldman's other son, he becomes a very prominent lawyer, and in fact does all the legal work for Kuhn Loeb. But that's a very interesting topic.
Well, thank you for a fascinating hour, very quick hour, Daniel, very enjoyable. And to our audience, thank you. On April 16th, 13 days from now, we're going to be live at McNally Theater at Fordham University's campus right across from Lincoln Center. And we have Fareed Zakaria in person with Ian Bremmer. So please sign up and consider joining us then. Thanks again, Daniel. Thank you, Suresh, and all our friends at Gabelli and Fordham. And thank you to the audience.
Thank you, David.